Nobody bid on the dead Aston Martin except a single father with $500 in his pocket. 14 days later, 3 billionaires were fighting over it for $50 million. The auction was held at 11 a.m. on a Saturday in October in a gravel lot behind Vance Prestige Motors on Route 9 in Danville, Ohio. Preston Vance ran the sale himself. 22 vehicles were listed that morning, seized from a bankrupt estate and sold off in a single lot to clear the books fast. Lot 19 was a silver two-door car nobody wanted to touch. The windshield was cracked corner to corner, the paperwork was missing pages. Preston stood next to it holding a clipboard and told the crowd it didn't run, didn't matter, and wasn't worth the tow. Nathaniel Cole raised his hand and offered $500. No one else bid against him. Preston laughed, said sold, and moved on to the next lot without shaking his hand. Nathaniel needed a car that would start every morning. His daughter Ivy was 8, her school recital was 9 days away, and their last car had died at the curb outside her school the week before. He signed the paperwork standing in the gravel. Then he crouched by the rear wheel and ran 2 fingers along a seam in the metal that didn't match anything he'd seen in 20 years of fixing cars for a living. He said nothing. He loaded the car onto a borrowed trailer and drove it home. 14 nights later, lying underneath that same car with a flashlight clenched in his teeth, Nathaniel found 4 letters and a number stamped in the chassis rail, a marking that should not existed on a car every official record listed as destroyed 22 years ago. He had 6 minutes before Ivy's school bus turned on their street. He didn't move. Danville, Ohio is a town of 11,000 people, and by the time Nathaniel Cole turned 39, most of them had stopped noticing him. He rented a single-bay garage on Larkspur Street for $600 a month, the kind of space with a hand-lettered sign out front and a heat spager that only worked in one corner. He fixed transmissions, replaced brake lines, and did oil changes for anyone in town willing to pay cash. Some weeks he made $1,100, some weeks he made $400. He had worked at Halloran Auto for 9 years before that, the biggest shop in the county, the kind of place with a service bay for every make of car and a manager who wore a tie to work. Nathaniel had been their best diagnostic mechanic, the one who could listen to an engine idle for 10 seconds and tell you which cylinder was misfiring. Then a lift fell under a truck in the 3rd bay, and his left hand came out of it 2 operations later, still working but slower than before. Halloran let him go 8 months after that. They called it a restructuring. Nathaniel called it what it was and didn't argue. His wife Diane had died 3 years earlier, ovarian cancer diagnosed in March, gone by October. She left behind a stack of medical bills that Nathaniel had reduced from $91,000 to $52,000 through 18 months of double shifts and small monthly payments he never missed. She also left behind Ivy, who was 5 when her mother died and was 8 now, and who had inherited her mother's habit of humming while she did homework. Nathaniel woke at 5:40 every morning. He made Ivy's lunch, the same turkey sandwich cut diagonally because she liked triangles better than rectangles, braided her hair in under 4 minutes, and drove her to Danville Elementary in a 14-year-old sedan with 209,000 miles on it. People in town knew him as the guy with the garage on Larkspur Street. A few knew he was at Halloran once. Almost none of them knew he used to be the best mechanic in the county because Nathaniel never mentioned it, and a man in a stained jacket pumping his own gas at the Marathon station on Route 9 doesn't usually get asked about his resume. That was the version of Nathaniel Cole that Preston Vance saw across a gravel lot on a Saturday morning, a workman with an outdated car and small bills folded in his palm. Preston had built Vance Prestige Motors over 11 years, selling used Bentleys and Porsches to buyers who arrived in sports coats. He had learned to read a customer's net worth in the first 4 seconds, and he had never been wrong about someone like Nathaniel. He was about to be wrong for the first time in his career, and he wouldn't find out for 14 days.
The car sat in Nathaniel's garage for 2 days before he touched it with anything but a rag. He'd hauled it home on a borrowed flatbed from his neighbor Curtis Boyle, who charged him $40 for the trailer and didn't ask questions. Ivy had ridden in the truck cab the whole way, drawing the car in a spiral notebook with more enthusiasm than accuracy, giving it wheels that were too round and a hood that was too long. On the third night, Nathaniel finally pulled the tarp all the way off under the shop light and started where he always started, the front left wheel, working backward, the way he'd been taught 19 years earlier by a foreman named Walt Pruitt, who used to say a car tells you the truth if you're patient enough to listen. This car had been lying to somebody for a long time. The battery was dead, which was expected. The fuel lines were dry, also expected. But the wiring harness under the dashboard had been cut in 4 places, not torn, not corroded, cut with the kind of clean diagonal snip you get from a proper set of side cutters. Nathaniel sat back on his heels and looked at that for a long moment. Vandalism doesn't usually happen in 4 clean, evenly spaced places. Vandalism is messy. This was surgical. He kept going. The frame showed no accident damage. The suspension bushings, which should have been dry and cracked on a car this old, were supple, almost new. Someone had replaced them, and replaced them well, sometime in the last few years, on a car that supposedly hadn't run in over 2 decades. At 1:14 in the morning, lying on a creeper under the front end with a work light clipped to his collar, Nathaniel found the first thing that truly stopped him: a bracket, hand-welded, holding the radiator mount at an angle he'd never seen on any production car. Not sloppy, not aftermarket, deliberate, built by someone solving a problem that hadn't been solved yet anywhere else. He called his old shop foreman, Walt Pruitt, the next morning at 7 a.m., before Ivy was even awake. He described the weld, the cut wiring, the suspension work, and asked Walt if he'd ever seen anything like it in 31 years of turning wrenches. Walt was quiet on the line for 9 full seconds. Then he said the only sensible next move was to stop touching anything until Nathaniel knew exactly what he was sitting on. Because cars built like that, he said, usually aren't cars at all. They're mistakes somebody was supposed to erase. Preston Vance heard about the car on a Thursday afternoon, 4 days after the auction, from a man named Douglas Reyes, who ran a body shop on the other side of Danville and had stopped by Nathaniel's garage to drop off a compressor part. Douglas mentioned in passing that the old Aston Martin sitting in Nathaniel's bay had some strange metalwork under the hood. Preston laughed it off at first. He told Douglas the car was scrap he'd been trying to get rid of for a year, that it came in on a bulk estate lot he never bothered cataloging, and that whatever Nathaniel thought he'd found was probably just cheap aftermarket junk from a previous owner with more money than sense. Nathaniel said this to 4 different people that week, and each time he said it, he believed it a little more. He wasn't alone in that certainty. On Friday, Nathaniel brought the wiring harness photos and a photo of the hand-welded bracket to Dale Whitfield, a longtime classic car restorer 2 towns over in Millfield, who advertised himself as an expert in British imports. Dale looked at the photos for less than a minute and told Nathaniel the car was almost certainly a Frankenstein, a wrecked original body dropped onto a different chassis by some backyard hobbyist in the 1980s, worth maybe $8,000 to the right buyer, and not worth the fuel it would take to drive it anywhere. Nathaniel asked him about the cut wiring, done in 4 clean, even places. Dale said kids do that kind of thing when they're stripping a car for parts. He said it with the flat confidence of a man who had seen thousands of cars and had stopped expecting to be surprised by one. Nathaniel thanked him and drove home saying nothing. That night he sat at his kitchen table with the torn black and white photograph Ivy had found in the glove box a week earlier, the one showing the Aston Martin parked in front of a large stone house, 4 words written on the back in faded blue ink: "Prototype never dies." Every expert who had looked at the car so far had looked at it the same way Preston had, quickly, from a distance, already certain of the answer before they'd asked a single real question. Nathaniel had learned something different from 19 years of listening to engines that other mechanics gave up on. Certainty wasn't the same as knowing, and so far, everyone who was certain about this car hadn't actually looked at it at all. He had 10 days left before the deadline Charlotte Hayes would later give him. He didn't know her name yet. He just knew he needed someone who would actually stop and look.
On the 7th night, Nathaniel found the marking. He was cleaning oxidation off the passenger side chassis rail with a wire brush, working under a shop light clamped to the frame, when the metal caught the light at an angle and showed him 4 characters stamped directly into the steel. Not a serial number, not a VIN, but a short, hand-cut code, AMP4. He stopped moving. He photographed it 3 times from different angles, then sat on the concrete floor and stared at it until his knees ached. He called Ryan Delgado that night. Ryan had been his closest friend since their apprenticeship at Holleran, and he'd left wrenching 15 years earlier to work in vehicle fraud investigation for an insurance consortium in Columbus. Nathaniel read him the marking exactly, letter by letter. Ryan didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had a flatness Nathaniel recognized as the sound Ryan made when he didn't like what he was about to say. He told Nathaniel that P designations inside British manufacturers from that era usually meant one thing: prototype. Hand-built test vehicles constructed outside the normal factory line, made to try out engineering ideas before the company committed to building them by the thousand. Only a handful were ever made of any single prototype, sometimes only one. Ryan asked for the VIN. Nathaniel found it on the door jamb and read it out. Ryan called back 4 hours later at 2 a.m. He'd run the number through a database he still had access to from his old fraud unit. The VIN had been removed from insurance records 22 years earlier. The notation on file said the vehicle was destroyed in an accident, total loss, case closed. No current registration existed anywhere in the country. On paper, the car Nathaniel had paid $500 for did not exist. Ryan told him that didn't necessarily mean it was stolen. It meant it was complicated, and that there was a real difference between the two, but that Nathaniel needed to stop working on it with ordinary tools and get someone in front of it who actually understood prototype-era construction. Because if he was reading this right, what sat in that garage might be worth more than either of them had ever priced a car for in their lives. Nathaniel didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table across from the torn photograph, "Prototype Never Dies," and understood for the first time that the 4 words weren't sentimental. They were a fact someone had written down 20 years before anyone would believe it. He had 7 days left before Charlotte Hayes' deadline, and he still didn't know her name. Charlotte Hayes answered her office phone on a Monday morning, expecting the usual calls she got twice a month, a stranger convinced their garage sale find was a lost masterpiece. She had built her name over 18 years authenticating rare British cars for 2 major auction houses, and she had learned to be patient with people and skeptical of their claims in equal measure. Nathaniel gave him his name, his town, and the marking exactly, AMP4. He said nothing else. Charlotte was quiet for 4 seconds, long enough that Nathaniel thought the call had dropped. Then she asked him to repeat it. She told him to send close-up photographs of the marking, the engine bay, the door skins, and the torn photograph with the handwriting on the back. Nathaniel sent them within 31 minutes. She called back that evening. Her voice hadn't lost its caution, but the caution had narrowed, now aimed at specific details instead of general disbelief. She said the marking was consistent with internal prototype coding used by British manufacturers in the early 1960s. She said the welded bracket in her photos matched no production technique she could find in any catalog. She said she needed to see the car in person, and she could be in Danville by Saturday. She arrived at 9 a.m. with an aluminum case of tools and spent 5 hours in Nathaniel's garage without saying more than a dozen words, removing panels, taking material samples from the door skins, examining the engine block through a loop worn on a cord around her neck. Ivy sat on a stool in the corner with her notebook and understood, the way children sometimes understand things adults have to be taught, that this was not a moment to interrupt. When Charlotte finally stood and turned to face him, the caution in her expression was still there, but underneath it was something she'd clearly spent the last 5 hours trying to keep contained. She told him the body panels were hand-formed aluminum, not factory-pressed steel. She told him the casting mark on the engine block matched a prototype specification, the manufacturer's own historical records listed as never having left the factory floor. She told him the alloy in the custom brackets matched materials used exclusively in a single experimental workshop in an 18-month window in the early 1960s. She told him that if the paperwork could be reconstructed to satisfy a major auction house, what was sitting in his garage was very likely the only surviving unit of a prototype the manufacturer's own records had long considered destroyed. Nathaniel asked her what that meant in dollars. She said carefully that she didn't want to guess yet, but she said the number, if she was right, would not have a comma in the wrong place. It would have several. Nathaniel sat down on the garage floor. He had 6 days left before the deadline he'd promised her, and he no longer had any doubt that the number Preston Vance had laughed at was about to become the smallest part of this story.
Word moves fast in a town the size of Danville, and by the time Charlotte Hayes drove back to Manhattan, enough people had seen her car in front of Nathaniel's garage to start asking questions. Within 4 days, the question reached Preston Vance. He showed up at the garage on a Wednesday afternoon without calling first, dressed the way he always was, pressed shirt, watch worth more than Nathaniel's truck, and he walked in like the space already belonged to him. He looked at the Aston Martin, then at Nathaniel, and smiled the way he had at the auction. He said there'd been an administrative error in the sale paperwork. He said the dealership needed to reverse the transaction, and he was prepared to hand Nathaniel $1,000 in cash on the spot to make it simple. Nathaniel wiped his hands on a shop rag and said he wasn't interested. Preston's smile thinned. He said the car's ownership records were irregular, that selling a vehicle with a disputed title chain could be a legal problem Nathaniel wasn't equipped to handle, and that it would be easier for everyone if Nathaniel just took the refund. Nathaniel said he'd talk to his attorney. Preston leaned against the doorframe and said quietly that Nathaniel should think hard about the difference between what he could afford to fight and what he couldn't, that a legal dispute over title could run for years and cost more than a man in Nathaniel's position could sustain. 7 feet away, Charlotte sat at her homework table. She didn't look up, but her shoulders went still, the particular stillness of a child listening harder than the adults around her realized. 3 nights later, at 2:14 a.m., Nathaniel woke to a sound at the garage side door. He crossed the dark yard in under a minute and found the padlock lying on the ground, picked, not broken. Inside, his document folder had been opened and its contents spread across the concrete. The rolling tool chest had been gone through. Nothing was missing. The Aston Martin hadn't been touched. Whoever came in wasn't looking for a car. They were looking for paper. A trail camera Nathaniel had installed after Preston's visit had recorded the whole thing. A man in a dark jacket moving along the side of the building between 11:52 p.m. and 2:19 a.m. The jacket had a logo stitched over the left chest. It was the logo of Vance Prestige Motors. Nathaniel uploaded the footage to 2 separate cloud accounts before sunrise and sent copies to Charlotte and Ryan. Then he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and made a decision that had been building since the night he first found the marking on the chassis rail. He had 5 days left, and he was no longer just restoring a car. He was building a case.
The 5 days that followed were unlike anything Nathaniel had lived through since the weeks after Diane died. Different in kind, but just as narrow, just as total. He worked from 5 a.m. until past midnight, sleeping on a cot in the corner of the garage, eating standing at the workbench. Ivy adjusted to the new rhythm without complaint, doing her homework at the same folding table every night, handing him tools before he asked for them, bringing him sandwiches on a schedule she seemed to set by instinct alone. On the 11th night, prying loose a dashboard panel someone had installed over the original aluminum, Nathaniel found a folded sheet of cream paper tucked into a cavity behind the gauge cluster. He called Ivy over, and together, under the shop light, they unfolded it. It was a letter, handwritten in blue-black ink gone brown with age, signed only with the initials R.H.W. The writer described building a single prototype vehicle for delivery to a private American buyer in the autumn of 1963, a car built to specifications the factory wasn't yet willing to put into general production. He wrote that its fate after delivery was unknown to him. The letter ended, "I have no doubt it will outlast all of us." Nathaniel started the engine on the 14th night. It turned over twice, hesitated, and fired, a deep, purposeful sound that filled the garage like something built for a much larger room. Ivy covered her mouth with both hands. Nathaniel gripped the wheel and didn't trust himself to speak for almost a minute. Charlotte arranged the sale through a closed, invitation-only auction in a private gallery in Lower Manhattan. 2 specialists flown in from England spent 2 full days authenticating the car and reached the same conclusion independently: genuine, unrepeated, no known surviving counterpart anywhere in the world. Preston Vance found out about the auction through contacts in the trade and talked his way past the credential desk with a borrowed business card. 40 minutes before bidding opened, he told 2 members of the auction staff, loud enough for the room to hear, that the car's ownership was disputed and that he intended to sue if the sale went forward. Charlotte was already moving. She handed the auction house's legal team a folder prepared for this, the notarized bill of sale, the full provenance file, the trail camera footage time-stamped from the break-in, and a sworn account of Preston's threats at the garage. The head of legal read it in 11 minutes, crossed the room, and told Preston the sale would proceed and that his continued presence was at the house's discretion. Preston sat back down. He said nothing for the next 3 hours. The bidding opened at $600,000 and climbed fast: $1 million, $5 million, $12 million, $28 million, until only 2 bidders remained, one in the room, one on the phone, trading numbers in increments of $1 million apiece. At $46 million, the phone bidder made the final offer. The gavel came down at $50 million. The applause lasted a long time. Nathaniel held Ivy's hand and didn't look at Preston once. He looked at the car. Silver, clean, finally seen for exactly what it had always been.
The morning after the auction, Preston found Nathaniel in the hotel lobby before checkout and asked to speak privately. Nathaniel agreed. They sat near the window, and Preston talked for several minutes about the original sale, about not knowing what the car was, about the money he'd sunk into his business over 11 years. He never quite apologized. He suggested that some share of the proceeds would be fair, given that he was, after all, the one who'd sold it to him. Nathaniel let him finish. Then he said, without raising his voice, that Preston had sold him that car for $500 because he was certain Nathaniel was too poor to know what he was looking at. He said Preston had threatened him, sent someone to break into his garage, and tried to stop a lawful sale in front of a room of witnesses. He said he owed him nothing. Then he stood, shook Preston's hand, out of habit more than courtesy, and walked away. The trail camera footage and the record of Preston's threats had already reached the district attorney's office through the auction house's legal team.
Within 2 weeks, investigators looking into the break-in found a wider pattern: altered title documents, contracts buyers said they were never given time to read, at least one estate sale where the administrator claimed he hadn't understood what he'd signed. Preston's dealer license was suspended. The showroom on Route 9 closed. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was slow, the kind that comes from a pattern finally catching up with itself. Nathaniel paid off the last $52,000 of Diane's medical debt the week the funds cleared. He rented a larger garage 2 blocks from Ivy's school and opened it under a new name, painted by hand on a plain white sign: Ivy's Classic Garage. He bought a reliable used sedan with a clean service history and drove Ivy to school in it the next morning. She said it was a good car and asked if they could listen to music. He said yes. 3 months later, Charlotte arranged for Nathaniel and Ivy to visit the car at its new owner's private collection outside Philadelphia. The owner, a quiet man named Walter Kessler, who'd spent 30 years researching the prototype program, walked them through the space himself. The Aston Martin sat in its own bay under warm, even light that showed every hand-shaped curve in the aluminum. Ivy stood in front of it for a long time, then asked her father if he was sad they didn't own it anymore. Nathaniel thought about it seriously, the way he always answered her questions. He told her the car had never really been theirs to keep, only theirs to find and understand and prove wrong the people who decided it was worthless. He said the money was real and the debt disappearing was real, but neither of those was the biggest thing. The biggest thing was simpler. Someone had decided he was worth nothing, and he'd shown them, with nothing but patience and his own 2 hands, that they were wrong. Ivy said the car had always known what it was. It had just been waiting for someone to actually look. Nathaniel didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said she was probably right. He drove her to school again the next morning, past the same curb in the same sedan. She had her backpack on her lap, and she didn't know yet everything her father had carried to protect her. She'd know someday. For now, she closed her notebook as they pulled up and said she'd see him at 3. He said he'd be there. And he was.